Tonight, we have 12 stories. From camping, outer space, and a lot more. A huge thank you to the generous authors who have allowed me to share these stories with all of you. Please be sure to drop a like and comment if you enjoy. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. You know those reborn baby dolls? Sometimes people get them because they have some mental handicaps that mean it wouldn't be safe for them to have kids, but they still want the feeling of nurturing and loving something so small and theirs, but admit the responsibility. I get that. I really do. I love raising my children, seeing them grow, hearing them laugh, having them laid on my chest as they slept through the afternoon when they were babies. The whole of it. But the responsibility is a lot. There's a lot of worry. You want them safe, but not coddled. Aware, but not anxious. A constant balancing act between your motherly concern and your motherly smothering. I liked it though, even the worry. I never minded it because the joy was so overwhelming. The joy and the love, such an infectious love, that ran through our house like vines. From the blanket in the living room where they played as babies, to the stool they stood on in the bathroom when we agreed that they were old enough to start brushing their teeth on their own, to the special child-safe knives in our kitchen drawer, second from the right, so they could help cut up the tomatoes for dinner, and to right up there in their beds, in their rooms, with the nightlight on to keep the nightmares away. I won't pretend there weren't hard or bad times. There were tons. But it was always overwhelmed in the end by the good. We had 3 kids by the end, my husband and I. Meredith is the oldest. She's 32 now, a parent herself. She calls me every other week and we talk and laugh and I get to speak to my grandbabies. I love them completely. It's a different love from the parental. The worry is subdued. The responsibility is gone. It's the full enjoyment of limitless and unconditional love, even if Miles is a little shit. He's 7. I can't begrudge him. Troy was the middle child. He's 30, and his husband makes them dinner every night because Troy is a terrible cook. He's a great programmer, though. He speaks a language so foreign to me, and my heart swells with pride. He loves being an uncle. He spoils those children rotten. I know him and Henry are thinking of adopting, but it's hard, even for them, who are such stable, gentle folk. He sometimes cries when he visits, because he wants to be a dad so bad that it hurts him. I can't do much. I pat him on the back and listen. I'm his mother, after all. You'd think Troy would have been the classic middle child, sort of squished between 2 big personalities. But my youngest was born when Troy was already 10. He was an accident. My little Elias. My last baby. He was always bolder than my other 2, getting into fights in kindergarten, getting sent to the principal's office for disrupting class. I know he started smoking when he was 13, drinking not long after. We were worried about him. We really were. A different worry from when Meredith and Troy were little. He felt purposely self-sabotaging, like something in his head was at war with himself. He came into the living room once when he was 16, put his head in my lap, and started sobbing that he wished it would stop. Everything in him would stop. That he could just disappear, leave behind no grief or sorrow, but just the easily replaced whole of his existence. Can't tell you how much I cried that night when I talked it over with my husband. We decided to pull him out of class for a bit and install him with a new therapist. He had had a few throughout school, but meshed with none of them. Too soft-spoken and pitying. This one wasn't. He came highly recommended by our neighbor, Colonel Brandon, a man I could only describe as hard-boiled, who had retired some 10 years back, and who had seen the therapist about some PTSD. He had always adored Elias. Felt some connection with him, I guess. Never an inappropriate closeness, but maybe a soft recognition from his youth. The new therapist worked wonders. Really did. Elias was blossoming. He went back to school, He was diagnosed with ADHD, which, strangely enough, seemed to really calm him down. He became medicated. For the first time, I felt his smiles were free from worry. He decided to join the military when he was 18. I wasn't a fan. I was worried. Worried about him not being able to handle how strict it would be, how scheduled and neat he would have to behave. It was a far cry from the messy teenager I had gotten used to sharing a home with, but he was adamant. I won't deny that I was proud, too. The colonel cried when we told him, moved to tears. My husband was just about glowing. He went in and got a buzz cut. That was the first change. His long, shaggy mane that I always had to clean strands from. The shower drain was gone. I teased him relentlessly about his new do. So did his siblings. We were all so proud. And he did well in the military. He was well-liked, hardworking, and charming. So it was no surprise that he quickly attracted the attention of the higher-ups. They gave him some grand opportunity, and he was elated to grab it. That's the last I know. I've told you a lot about Elias, mostly to not forget. He was supposed to come home one weekend last year for my husband's birthday. We were going to pick him up from the airport. We were so excited. I had spoken to him on the phone the day before. He had told me how much he looked forward to coming home. And maybe stay for a bit? He said. And his voice broke a little from what I assumed was exhaustion. I wish you could, love, but you have to go back to work, don't you? I said. I don't think I want to do this anymore. It's a lot. It's a lot of sacrifice, you know? Lots of stuff I'm going to be missing out on. Like Mare's kids. I miss them. Won't they miss their Uncle Eli? He said. I suppose I agreed. It was the last time we spoke, but I only remember fragments. That's the trick when you don't know it's the last time. It doesn't really seem all that special. On the day of the party, I asked my husband who would pick him up. He asked me who I was talking about, if I had invited anyone, that he didn't know anyone named Elias. I felt the cold rush to my stomach and that familiar, all-consuming worry. I was too young for a husband with dementia. I tried to find a picture of Elias on my phone to jog his memory, but there were none. All the pictures where I could have sworn my son would be right there, smiling, there were gaps or it was filled by someone else. A photo of him eating ice cream on the pier was actually a picture of Troy. Him dancing wildly with his then-girlfriend at Meredith's wedding was a snapshot of my nephew and his wife. There was no Elias to be found. I went up to his childhood bedroom, which we had kept mostly intact for when he came home on weekends. It was still childishly decorated, but there were 2 twin beds in there, 2 new to have been his, and my grandbaby's names were written on the door. I called off the party. My husband was happy to indulge me. We stayed in bed instead, as I cried into his chest and he cried too. I felt that I had lost my son. He felt that he was losing his wife. Felt like a prank at first, but the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. If I casually mentioned him in conversation, people would ask who I was talking to. I asked Meredith who had owned the shiny red bike after her, and she told me that we gave it to her cousin, even though I know I took a picture of Elias on it when he had his 8th birthday. The colonel thought I was the one who had gone to the therapist. I tried to forget it. I was otherwise sane. My doctor told my husband I must have been delirious from dehydration, something he was more than eager to believe. Some days I almost believe it myself. But there's that hinge that binds me and Elias. Called a mother's love, called insanity. But my life hinges on his like a chain. There is no without him, and I have my proof for when I'm doubting. A postcard we sent the week before the party, returned home to us because the recipient doesn't exist. A postcard starting out with Dear Elias, and ending with my signature, and my husband's. You know those reborn baby dolls? Sometimes people get them to remember their lost children. Maybe they've grown up and are no longer as small and easy to handle, or maybe the child was stillborn. I don't judge. I get it. You need something tangible to remember how much we love what's gone. Sometimes you just need that hinge to what you've lost. Maybe that's why I'm writing this. I'm forgetting. Most of the time I can't remember his name. It takes effort to remember his face. I think he used to have long hair. I think he used to be trouble. I don't want to be my husband. I don't want to forget. My life, it hinges on Ethan's. Elias. Sorry, not Ethan, Elias. You see, that's why I'm so scared. I walked into the kitchen yesterday and my husband didn't recognize me for the first 5 minutes. He was screaming at me to get out of his house. Meredith doesn't call me anymore. I showed up at her door the other day, and she thought I was her old teacher. My life hinges on his. I just wasn't aware my existence did too. And now that I'm forgetting him, others are forgetting me. Don't forget me. Please. Everyone's had their heart broken. Everyone's had an ex who remains a problem long after the relationship ends. But my story's different. My last relationship started as many do. Boy meets girl, boy gets to know girl, boy falls for girl. That relationship ended as many do. With hindsight, we all learn that blame is usually shared when it inevitably breaks down and the end comes. I don't like to air dirty laundry, but some scant details are required to tell this tale. Addiction comes in many forms. What people who have never loved an addict fail to realize is the addict doesn't just destroy their own existence. They destroy the existence of those closest to them. I was lost while I was going to someone else's habit, and I broke a girl's heart when I walked out. Months after the relationship ended, I'd wake up daily to miss phone calls and text messages from her number. To keep ignoring them was the hardest thing I've done in my entire life. To stay with her had become an extreme sport. My life had literally been in danger on more than one occasion due to some of the company she kept. Then it happened. I received the news 3 weeks ago. News I had always feared wasn't a question of if, but when. She had died. Her body couldn't take the abuse her addiction had put it through any longer. The guilt I felt. Well, there's simply no way to put it in words. Those lingering questions I'll always live with. Should I have stuck by her a little longer? Should I have checked on her? Should I have answered the phone? I attended the funeral. I was one of only a handful. I had one final conversation with her, knowing she couldn't speak back. I told her I loved her. I missed her, and I was sorry. A week went by. Sleep came, but not easily. She remained on my mind at all times. Then it happened. I woke up to find a solitary missed phone call from her number on my phone. There was a message alert for a voicemail to go with it. I stared at it for the longest time. A range of thoughts went through my brain. My gut told me someone had her phone. I called my message bank and played the message. I miss you too. The voice of my ex whispered. My blood ran cold. I thought I was dreaming. This couldn't be real. I tried to calm down. I rationally decided that it was an old call she made weeks ago, that for some reason only showed up now. I went about my day and I put it out of my mind. By the time I went to bed the next night, I'd almost forgotten about it. I woke up the next day. Same again. Another missed call from my ex's number. Another voicemail. I played it. My ex's voice whispered, "Why won't you answer? I miss you. I'm coming up to your house." It sent shivers down my spine. It had been something she had done periodically at 2 and 3 in the morning the last few months before she died, when I wouldn't answer her calls. I called the phone company. After getting the runaround and being transferred through different offices, I got an answer that I didn't want. The calls weren't old. They'd been made at the same time I'd received them, from the cell tower nearest, where my ex used to live. I honestly don't know how, but I slept the next night. The stress of the past few months had me running on fumes. I woke up the next morning. No missed calls. What I did have were 2 picture messages. They had both been sent by the number belonging to my ex. The first was a close-up picture of my street sign. The second was a picture of the front of my house taken from the sidewalk. The part that terrified me? A shadow draped over the front lawn of a woman, the same slender build as my ex, long and drawn out under the dim light afforded by the street lamp opposite my house. Attached to the second picture were the words, "I'll see you soon. I love you too." I contacted the phone company for the second consecutive day. They informed me that both texts had been sent when I received them. These had bounced from the cell tower closest to my house. I decided that the only possible explanation was that someone had my ex's phone and had decided to play the sick game on me. I said to myself, tonight I wouldn't sleep. Tonight I'd stay awake and catch them in the act. That night I stayed in my lounge room, kept the lights off, the curtains open, and stared from my couch through the front window to the street. The last time I remember checking the time, it was close to 4 a.m. The next thing I remember is waking up on the couch to the sun's bright rays, declaring the day had started. I picked up my phone to check the time. I had a new picture message. I opened it as the realization hit me. The blood drained from my face. It was a picture of me asleep on the couch taken from outside the lounge room window. And the reflection of the window, where the camera flashed, had sparked. I saw her skin deathly pale, devoid of color, her black shoulder-length hair neatly straightened. She was wearing the simple black dress she had been buried in. Her eyes were jet black, no white in them at all. Her face was frozen in a maniacal grin, the kind of grin showing aggression, no warmth or happiness. There were words attached to this picture, too. It simply read, "Tomorrow I'll take you with me." I packed what I could and I left. I've been on the move ever since, hopping from town to town, hotel to hotel. No matter how far I go, it'll eventually not be enough. I still wake up to messages, missed calls, and pictures. Always the same. She loves me. She misses me. She'll see me soon. It started when Todd went missing. The whole town dropped everything they were doing and searched. Every nook and cranny of the small town we lived in, they searched it all. That's how it went when the first 3 kids went missing. But after the 4th, everyone got worried. The town became suspicious. Whose kid would be next? The curfew seemed to help for a little bit, but even that little speck of hope didn't last 2 weeks. Another one went missing. I can't say I was any different from the town. I was as worried as the next person. I had 2 little twins. They were my life, my everything. Until one night it took one of them from me. I was trying my hardest to fall asleep that night when I heard one of my kids screaming. Then nothing. It's like someone had stopped him as quick as possible. I shot out of bed like any parent in my situation. I was still on edge over the very recent kidnappings. I threw open my door and sprinted to their door, quickly opening it. I stared in, paralyzed. It stood over one of my boys, a hand over his mouth. The thing was tall and lanky in the 10-foot-tall room. It was crouching, the top of its spine jabbing into the ceiling. It had 3 sets of arms running down its body, with almost spider-like legs. That's when it looked at me. I don't know how I didn't notice it at first, but after seeing the long white beard and the overly red cheeks, it was obviously something dressed as Santa. Its hat warped with its flesh, and running up the red leather is what I can only describe as veins. The suit was very loose on it, but obviously very stiff, almost like it was made of skin and muscle. Its soulless eyes so black I couldn't even tell if there was even pupils. It stared at me and spoke. Ho, ho, ho. I was paralyzed. I wanted to run and save my boy, but I couldn't move. With a blink of an eye, it picked up my 2 boys by their throat. And that's when I broke. I sprinted over to it, not caring about my own safety. I lunged at the creature, but fell flat on my face. I looked up, wincing. It was gone, not leaving a trace. I can't tell you where it went, or even that it jumped out the window. It was just gone. I sat there for hours staring at the wall, trying hard to wrap my head around what happened about the monstrosity that was just in my son's room. About how my son was just another statistic. What was I going to tell my ex-wife? That some monster dressed like Santa broke into my son's room and disappeared without a trace? So I did the only thing that I could have done. I said nothing. Acted like my son was just another face on a missing kid poster. At first I prayed that my boys were still alive, that one day I would get them back. But knowing what I know now, I wish the thing would have killed them. By the time winter came and went, almost half of the town was missing. Nobody talked about it. No one dared mention it. And for a couple years, we thought it was over. That we would never get our children back. Our whole town was worried for the next couple winters. But we soon forgot about it as much as a grieving parent could. That wasn't until every family that had lost a child received a package. It was a present with dark red wrapping paper and a red bow. I received two. I stared at those two presents for almost 20 minutes just praying it wasn't what I thought it was. It was so much worse. That's when I heard my neighbor scream. Then another neighbor. Then another. I couldn't take it anymore. I lifted the lid of one of the presents and joined into the growing noise of screaming and shouting. From inside the packages, two eyes stared up at me. I knew from the moment I saw them, they were my Todds. The eyes weren't attached to anything, but frantically looking around, trying to figure out where they were. The eyes were laying in a mound of blood and flesh. That's when he spoke. In a soft, gravelly whisper, my son talked. "Please, Dad, kill me." The mouth that he was speaking out of was also just combined in the sludge that was once my son. I fell to my knees sobbing, screaming, crying. What had it done to my son? And why? A realization soon came over me, and I slowly turned my head over to the other present. Sat there patiently waiting for me to open it. Waiting. First, for starters, a little background on me. I moved to a new state not too long ago to catch up with my wife and attend my college up there. I used to be in my old career field, but now, since I moved here, I had to change it since there really isn't a demand for my previous field, and I'm starting a new major now. So while I go to college, I work as a custodian for a school district. Some of the most stable and amazing jobs to have as a college student, but it brings me a feeling of satisfaction. I worked at one 45 minutes away from me previously, and about a month ago, moved to my new one. This new job is only 10 minutes away and pays $2 more an hour and better HR. But nonetheless, like I said, it's only temporary. Let's get into what you're listening to this for. When you normally interview for a custodian position, especially for second shift, you're more than likely going to be asked this question. Are you okay with working alone in a building at night? Me being desperate, happily obliged, not even considering I get terrified from being alone. But hey, it pays the bills, so what can I really say? I got through the hiring process for my new district and was started at the elementary school so they could get a feel for how experienced I am on custodial work. The first 3 nights flew by easy because I had a guy with me that trained me. And I rarely would be alone since a lady comes in at 8 to 12 to do 4 hours split between 2 buildings. So 3 to 7, I would be alone, but normally the building doesn't get empty until 6 or 6:30-ish. My first night without my trainer was a whim of overwhelming emotions. Since I was no longer being helped, it made my tasks a lot slower. But I managed, and when I got to my bathrooms, that's when shit started happening. No pun intended. I was running through my routine of sanitizing and then cleaning the bowls and then mopping. when I felt this just utter sense of dread wash over me. I remember feeling like I had to walk outside and take a break. I was already ahead on my work, so I walked outside, hid away from the cameras, and took a quick little smoke break to calm my nerves. After finishing off my cigarette, I walked back in, got the bathrooms done, and when the lady showed up at 8, I jokingly asked her, "Is the building haunted or something?" And she dreadfully looked at me saying, "What happened?" I explained to her the feeling of dread, and she explained that's why the last guy quit, and how she hates coming over here. See, the thing is, the district failed to inform me I worked in the oldest building. This was the old high school, from the 1910s to the 1920s. She went on to explain how much strange activity went on, from doors slamming shut to custodians being shoved. Luckily for me, that never happened. But in the 1 week I spent at the elementary school, needless to say, if they ever try to send me back, I might have to deny going. My last elementary school experience. My only other occurrence was my last night there. It was the Friday of my first week working for my district. As far as I knew at the time, I was at the elementary school until further notice, and by 5:30 the building was empty. I was vacuuming floors and had worked my way to next to the gymnasium. That's when I heard it, the door slamming shut. Well, normally, I wouldn't find this unusual since teachers leave through there all the time. Normally, the door just closes slowly and it's a huge metal door. It's not quite easy to just slam shut. I walked inside the almost dark gymnasium to see no activity. That's what I thought until I heard door handles shaking all around. I'm not gonna lie. I made an about face and ran to my truck. And I didn't go back in until my coworker showed up 2 hours later, and still ended up getting finished on time to go home. That weekend, I dreaded Monday. I thought about quitting, but then my luck hit. I got a call from my operations saying there was a full-time slot at the middle school, and I was invited to take it, and a minor pay raise, meaning better pay, even closer to home, and I wouldn't be alone anymore. The middle school. So, here at the middle school, I work with the guy who trained me. Really stand-up guy. We have the same work ethic, and we tend to get a ton done in a shift. But needless to say, being alone or just with another person doesn't make the spirits quiet down at all. Besides, I've been there damn nigh 3 weeks, and while there isn't quite as much as the elementary school, I still experience things. My first experience at the middle school, so if some of you don't know, custodians generally do not clean the entire building. Each building is divided into what I call sections, and you clean that area and a certain amount of classrooms, etc. While COVID has been going on, there have been no sport events in my district, which has been a huge workload off of us, because that means more time we have to do small details and other tasks. But this night, about a week in, I had to clean the girls' locker room. Well, it was not in use due to COVID. I thought it would save me the trouble of letting it build up. The locker room is huge. Pink lockers, a couple of bathrooms, showers, and a door going outside. Problem with this is, there's only one light switch, and you guessed it, it's on the other side of the locker room. Meaning you have to walk across it in pitch darkness to cut it on. Thank you, electricians. Very cool. But anyways, I go down there and cut the light on and start scrubbing down lockers when I notice out of nowhere a shadowy figure walk almost seamlessly by. Now I know. When you're alone in somewhere normally populated, the mind plays tricks, but this was plain as day. I turned around and nothing was there, and the rest of the time in there felt watched. At one point, I could have sworn the AC was broken because it was freezing. I'm from Virginia originally and moved up north, so I'm not used to cold. But this change was sharp. One other story from the middle school. So I'm really not going to get into the little creaks and the occasional footsteps I hear. But this story was from my coworker and former trainer on a night me and him were cleaning. I was in my area doing my thing, while he was in his. Normally if I need his help or he needs mine, he calls me. Since the man I work with has had 3 heart attacks, I worry, so I'll call him from time to time just to check in. Beats quitting what you're doing to walk across the school to find someone. And just as soon as I walk out of a classroom, he's in the hallways walking to me looking frightened. I ask him what's up. For now, we'll just call him B. B. Did you come down to my section? No. Why? Well, I swear you came into my classroom, asked me a question, and walked away without hearing my answer. I literally have not moved down there at all. Plus, I'm already a little bit behind, so I would have called. What the fuck? You never had anything weird happen before? Fuck no. I don't believe in that shit. I never walked down there. My dad loves camping. Actually, my dad's entire side of the family is very outdoorsy. It's never really been much my thing, but I do have a soft spot for camping since we've grown up camping pretty much every single summer. Ever since I was about 8. We've gone camping on an island out in a large lake located about 6 hours from my hometown. I won't specify exactly where, but I will say it's in the US. Honestly, I feel like we're probably all insane for continuing to come to this place year after year, even after the weird shit we've seen. But it's otherwise a really fun place to camp. Aside from literally everything I'm about to tell you, it makes for a great vacation spot. Very secluded and relaxing. Originally, we were in a small group. Just me, my brother, and dad. My dad's best friend and his son, and a good friend of mine, since my dad figured little 8-year-old me wouldn't want to be stuck with a group of boys all weekend. Over the years, the 5 of us have continued going, but our numbers have grown. Now, we usually end up with a group of up to 9 or 10 people, comprised of family members and other close friends. We've been camping on this island every summer since we were kids for the past 11 years. It wasn't a pre-existing tradition either. My dad just decided one day that it would be a great idea to pack up and live in the woods on an island for a week. It turned out to be right, and now we're here. By this point, we all know the place practically as well as our hometown. 2 years ago, my family actually bought a little cabin out on the island, which we use often in the summer and rent out to other visitors when we aren't occupying it. Point being, we've been visiting this island for nearly as long as I can remember. As much as I love the place, there is some weird and unexplainable shit that goes on out there. The following events are just some strange things that have happened to me and my friend, who we'll call Violet, throughout the years. But I do plan on asking my fellow island visitors if they've had any weird or creepy experiences during any of our trips. This first one happened either the first or second year we headed to the island for the weekend. The campsite we frequent is set right on the water, so that some of the sites even face out over the lake. Our campsite was set a bit farther back, but was still within easy walking distance of the lake, so the 4 of us kids would spend most of the day in a constant loop from campsite to lake and back to campsite again. Another thing about this campground, it was empty almost every single time we stayed there. There were a couple of years where 1 or 2 other groups would be there at the same time as us. But it was rare. In hindsight, we probably should have taken that into consideration before setting up camp there year after year. It was a very bare-bones campground. 2 outhouses and a shed full of logs parked near the entrance. 1 water pump alongside the path to the beach. Some of the sites were even overgrown with tall grass and bushes, to the point where there was nowhere to actually put a tent. Anyway, on this particular day it was sunny, so everyone was parked out on the beach with towels and a cooler of cold sodas. It was early afternoon, and Violet and I had been sent back to the campsite to grab the second cooler, which was packed full of snacks for lunch. What I remember vividly isn't our walk to the campsite, but the walk back to the beach. There's a dirt road that winds all throughout the campground, leading to each individual site, and which eventually wanders all the way to the beach. Violet and I were taking that path, just rounding the bend so that the bank of tall grass just before the beach was visible a little further ahead of us. We must have been talking because I remember her suddenly motioning for me to be quiet. We slowed to a stop, gradually. The kind of stop you do when you know something isn't right, but you aren't quite ready to think about it yet. We stopped in the middle of the path, in broad daylight, and gave each other confused glances. My arms had started to ache, so I set down the cooler. Something about the air in that moment, our sudden silence, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It took a moment for the realization to set in. As I mentioned, this campground was tacked right on the edge of the island, so that the lake was audible at pretty much all hours of the day. It had been especially loud today, with a strong south wind stirring the waves into a bit of a frenzy, so much that the sound had eventually faded into the background like white noise. The sound of the waves hadn't disappeared, but it wasn't coming from the lake ahead of us. It was coming from the woods to our left. I remember the feeling of dread when that realization struck me. It was as if all the moisture was sucked from my throat as my stomach shrank in on itself. The sound itself was almost perfect. The wet slap of the waves against the rocks, followed by a bubbling, frothing, hissing as the water crawled backwards before being stirred into another wave. Crash, hiss, repeat. But it was too wet, which doesn't make sense, because it sounded like a lake, so of course it was wet. But I just remember thinking that it sounds wet. Not wet like water, but more organic. What should have been the crash of wave against rock sounded more meaty, like a bucket of water thrown over someone's bare chest. Hollow and raw. The hiss was wrong, too. It sounded too breathy. It sounded like breathing. Like something trying to imitate the sound of the lake with heavy, swampy breaths. I think Violet and I both realized it at the same time, because when I jerked around to look at her, her eyes were as wide and panicked as I imagined mine must be. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, something exploded out of the bushes directly to our left. It moved so quickly that neither of us got a good look at it. All I know is that whatever it was too big to be a rabbit, but too small to be a deer. But it had antlers, and it moved like nothing I'd ever seen before. If you've ever watched an old, scratched-up DVD, think of how the characters move around when the DVD is skipping, but not quite frozen. Kind of jerky and glitchy, jumping from place to place, but leaving a trail of pixels whenever they move their limbs. It moved like that, but without the skips that come in between. Just really distorted, twisted steps. I swear I saw that thing's insides as it wrenched its way across the path. Its mouth was shuddering open and shut like a fish. We were frozen for about 3 seconds after it disappeared into the trees on the other side of the path. After that, we took off for the beach without saying a word. When we tried to tell my dad and Drew, my dad's friend, what had happened, they both told us it was probably a deer. It was not a fucking deer. Violet and I still talk about that sometimes. I think that was the first instance where it occurred to us that this may not be an entirely ordinary island. By now, we've reached a consensus that it definitely isn't an ordinary island. But we've been going for so long that it's sort of become that, well, this might as well happen mentality. The next one I'll tell you about happened 2 years after that, when I was around 10. As I mentioned earlier, this campground barely even qualified as a campground. I mean this in the nicest way possible, because I love the place, but it was terrifying to walk around there at night. Weird rabbit deer creatures aside, the place was pitch black after 9 o'clock, and as a kid, the thought of walking to the outhouse alone was unfathomable. One of the outhouses was located, and I am not joking, in the middle of the woods with no paths actually leading to or away from it. Yeah, we'll get to that later. And the other one was parked on the edge of the circle drive that sat right in front of the beach. So, I'm 10, and I'd rather suffer the whole night than walk to the cobwebby outhouse by myself now that it's dark. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could, trying not to wake Violet, and padded across the campground to the fire. where my dad was still sitting drinking a beer. As far as I could tell, Drew had already retreated to his tent with his son, and my brother was passed out in the tent he shared with Dad. Dad walked me to the outhouse and waited for me outside. One thing I should note about the outhouse: opening the door and coming out, you can see directly across the dirt circle drive to the path that leads through the bank of tall grass and down onto the beach. I keep saying beach, but I mean that in the same way that someone who says outhouse means clean, pleasant restroom. The beach at this campsite was rocks, not even pebbles. Just straight up 2 miles of rocks. You had to wade a good 15 to 20 feet out into the water before you would hit sand. That wasn't painful to walk on. So I opened the door, and the first thing I saw was a tall figure, standing at the mouth of the beach path. It took a second for my eyes to get used to the darkness, but then I realized it as Drew. I remember being confused for a moment because I'd been sure he was sleeping. Feeling of realization dawning a second later, Drew was, and still is, a practical joker. One of his favorite pastimes during these camping trips is to see how many times he can scare us kids completely out of our skin. So I thought, oh, okay, he's going to loop around and hide on the path and scare me on our way back. Hilarious. At the time, I didn't think about how impractical it would have been for him to come all the way down to the beach and then loop back when he could have easily just gone and hid in the bushes along the path while I was using the bathroom. Give me a break. I was 10 and probably thinking about Harry Potter. Figuring I might as well let him know that he'd been seen, I waved at him and rolled my eyes as if to say, nice try. Instead of waving back, he tilted his head slowly to one side as if confused. He lifted a hand limply into the air but didn't wave it. Then he smiled and turned, hand still raised, and walking up the path and out of sight. By now I had a weird feeling in my stomach. I asked my dad if he and Drew had been planning a joke on me, but he said Drew had gone to bed. I was adamant that he hadn't, and insisted that we walk over to the beach to join him because he must have come out after us, to see the stars or look at the water or whatever the hell people do on a beach at 11 o'clock at night. My dad obviously thought I was crazy, but he followed anyway as I led the way over to the water. We walked up the path, through the tall grass, and out onto a completely open stretch of rocks met by eerily calm water. To this day, part of me thinks it was still an elaborate joke done by my dad and Drew to scare the shit out of me. In which case, it definitely worked. And props to them for commitment. Technically, he could have looped around and sprinted back through the trees to our campsite without me ever seeing him. Like I said, the campground was empty most of the time aside from us, so we wouldn't have been disturbing anyone. The other part of me remembers how, when that thing turned around, everything but its head was facing away from me before it seemed to remember that its head was supposed to turn too. And it snapped around lightning quick, all without ever losing that fucking smile. That's the part of me that thinks, yeah, okay, probably not. This is the last one I'll tell you for now, and it happened 2 summers ago. We had just put the final touches on the house, bringing in dishes and whatnot. After an unfortunate incident during which we sat down for dinner and realized there was not a single plate to be found in the entire house, and were staying there for the rest of the week before heading back home that Sunday. There was a whole crowd of us in one small house, so everyone was spread out all over. Violet and I were sharing the very top room, which everyone referred to as the loft, even though it wasn't technically a loft and there was an actual loft just down the stairs and to the left. The layout of the house is actually kind of important here, so I'll explain it as best as I can. At the very top is the loft, which is actually just a small bedroom at the highest point of the house. There are stairs leading down from that room to a small catwalk, which looks down on the living room and kitchen area. The catwalk leads to the actual loft, which holds a bunk bed and a couple of closets. Turning right at the end of the catwalk will take you down another set of stairs to a landing, where there's another bedroom and 2 bathrooms. One more set of stairs leads down to the living room and kitchen. Anyway, It was some unthinkable hour of the morning that normally I would have no trouble sleeping straight through. For some reason, I woke up. Have you ever been dreaming really heavily, and when you wake up, it's almost like you were just slammed back into your bed, like you'd fallen from the sky? That's how I woke up. My chest felt heavy with dread, the way it usually does after a nightmare. I could feel my heartbeat thudding along slow and syrupy. I looked to my right, expecting to see Violet passed out beside me, but she wasn't there. I sat up, looked straight ahead, and jumped. Violet was standing at the foot of the bed, right in front of the window, blocking the faint light from outside so that she was barely a silhouette in the blurry darkness. My vision is shit without my glasses on. She was looking at me completely devoid of expression, her eyes flat and her mouth slack. Her hands hung at her sides, but one of them was open as if she had been searching for something. Her fingers splayed. Like I said, my glasses were off, so I genuinely don't remember if I saw this or if I imagined it. At first I thought her hand was twitching, but as I squinted and looked closer, it was less like the hand itself was moving, and more like something was writhing and pulsating beneath her skin. "What are you doing?" I mumbled, still half asleep and more than a little unnerved. Without taking her eyes off me, she reached for the door with the partially open hand and fumbled for the door handle. Her fingers moved weirdly, as if her hand had fallen asleep in that position and she hadn't gotten feeling back to her fingertips yet. She left the door wide open when she left. I sat there with my heart pounding as I gradually woke up. My brain was already filling in the gaps with logic. It was late, she was tired, I was tired, could even be sleepwalking. She came back into the room a few minutes later and there was an immediate shift in energy. You know when something weird has happened and it's like the air itself gets heavier, almost harder to breathe. As soon as she walked back inside, shutting the door this time, it felt easier to breathe again. She must have sensed the change in atmosphere because she gave me an odd look as she climbed back into the bed. "You okay? You seem way too relieved to see me." By that point, I think I already knew what was going to happen, but it still caused an awful sinking in my chest as I asked her why she'd been acting so strange when she left the room, and watched the color slowly drain from her face. There was a moment of tense silence. Then Violet swallowed and said, "So that wasn't you on the landing?" Apparently, this is what had happened on her end. She had gotten up to use the bathroom, gone down the stairs to the landing, where she had seen me. She was understandably confused, seeing as she had just left me lying in bed, but wrote it off, figuring she'd been too tired to notice that I wasn't there. She had barely glanced over at me anyway, and it was dark. According to her, while I had been laying in bed asleep, I had also been standing on the landing, staring straight up at the skylight above with my mouth slack and my eyes blank, one hand open and twitching weirdly at my side. Violet had said my name, and that was when whatever this thing was had turned and gone up the stairs to our room. She said it wasn't until the thing passed her that she got any sense that something was wrong. When it passed her, she said there was a sharp whiff of something acrid, like old meat gone bad. There had also been a low, garbled mumbling, but the thing's mouth never moved. I asked her if she had seen anything on her way back up to the room. She hadn't. To this day, I have no idea what that thing was or where it went. These are just the stories I tend to tell people the most, around campfires or at parties, back when those were still a thing. There's a lot of weird shit that goes on this island, and I know my brother and other family, or friends, who have come out over the years will have some stories to tell as well. We all love the place, but we've learned over the years that those noises in the woods are usually best left uninvestigated. It's Christmas. It's a day to reunite with their family and celebrate together. The streets are filled with beautiful lights. Kids are outside building snowmen. That's what I used to think. I remember I was 7 or 9 when it happened. Back then, before Thanksgiving, I would celebrate it with my friends. Lorraine, Caitlin, Charlie, and Frank. Every year we would go to Charlie's house 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Let me tell you, Charlie was rich. He would host the best Christmas parties, like the best of the best. We would play games and then have a sleepover at his house. The thing that made it so special was the presents game. The rules are simple. Charlie would prepare 4 presents. Since there will be 5 people, one of us will have to go home empty-handed. 2 of the 3 presents will have a small prize, usually a pencil box or just a water tumbler. Another will have something like a small toy or a stuffed animal. And the last will be a big prize. You can imagine how excited we are to get that prize. The lights will be turned off so we can't see the presents and memorize its color. When the music plays, we will pass the presents around until the music stops, and we would reveal what we got. Everything went as normal until we turned on the light to see that everyone got a present. Charlie then pointed out that he did not recognize the patterns on Caitlin's present. It had red spots sprinkled around it which looked kind of like plum blossoms. There was also a tag on it with cursive written with red ink that said, "Merry Christmas." Immediately it freaked us out. We shaked it a little. It kind of felt like a round object that was kind of heavy. We opened it, and a bad odor started to reek out. Not a good thing. There was a black plastic bag that had something inside. Caitlin immediately backed off and said that she wouldn't touch it. Frank, being the bravest of the bunch, started to untie it. Something black and fuzzy came out of it. Upon closer inspection, it looked like hair. Frank then dumped out the whole thing. What we saw was enough to cause nightmares for years to come. It was a human head. A little girl's head to be exact. She looked as if a chunk of her head was bitten off. She looked like she was terrified before she died. Her mouth still agape, eyes still open. Charlie went to call his mother, which proceeded to call the police. We had to go home early. The next day, we all agreed to never talk about it. Even though we continued the tradition of meeting up, we never played that game anymore. Ever since then, the parties just didn't feel the same. Instead of seeing it just as a party, we gathered around to take 1 hour to just appreciate that we are alive, living, and breathing. What we saw changed us, and let us see how our lives could be so easily claimed. I always wonder who will be the next person that would have their head claimed as an offering to someone else. I don't know what killed that girl. I just hope they never hurt us. Well, as you may know by now, for most of 2020, the pandemic forced schools and universities all over the globe to replace their physical classrooms by online classrooms. The story did not happen now. Instead, it happened in early August. I didn't want to share it with others before, but I think that maybe, if I do, others will tell me of similar experiences and help me deal with what's happened. It was a Thursday. It was 10:27 a.m., only 3 minutes before the time when my philosophy class usually started. From one class to another, we used to have 30 minutes of spare time, which I usually used to stretch my legs, go to the bathroom, eat something, and watch some TV or Netflix. I just had left the toilet and joined the online class when it started. The small square where my philosophy teacher, Wallace, usually resides was all shaky and filled with static. Like it had somehow glitched. It only took a few seconds before it stopped, so I shrugged it off as some kind of bug. A few moments later, Wallace arrived and started. Most of the members of my class were also present, around 2/3 of the students, because some were still asleep or just evading class. Class started, and the lesson was about Pythagoras' theories on the soul and his disagreements with Parmenides. Around some 15 minutes into the class, first began occurring. We saw someone or something moving very fast behind the teacher. First I shrugged it off as my imagination, but then it happened again. The thing moved a little bit slower this time, and I could tell it wasn't my imagination. Have you seen it, guys? Someone asked in our students-only WhatsApp group. I was wondering if it was only me. Another one of the colleagues texted. Maybe we should warn him that something is moving behind him and it's interrupting our focus. Another one said. It could be an animal or one of his children running around. I said. I didn't entirely believe that was the case, but it was the Occam's razor alternative. We then had a few more minutes of class without disturbances, and then someone joined the reunion. Lord_Straxos. This one is new to me. Wallace laughed. Welcome, Lord Straxos. Care to share with us who you really are? He waited for around 15 seconds, but there was not an answer. Well, I guess we'll have to call you by your alias, Mr. Straxos. Any doubt you have, make sure to reach me. The class then continued. The teacher seemed calm, but there was something unnerving me. I could feel there was something very wrong going on. After another 10 minutes, Straxos' microphone was turned on. His volume was low, but we could hear it. It was a baby crying. Wallace didn't notice it, but I and some of the students did. The discussion almost instantly restarted on WhatsApp, and then one of my colleagues, Lucas, snapped. Wallace, please ban this Lord whatever. I'm trying to pay attention to the class, but they're creeping me out, he said on the microphone. I thought the baby was coming from the neighbor. Listen, Lord, I know this may be funny to you, but please respect your colleagues. Otherwise, I'll have to kick you, the teacher said. Lord Straxos then activated his camera. I couldn't see anyone, but it looked like he was transmuting from a large, abandoned place. It looked like a hospital or an asylum. We could see large, gray, rotten corridors, litters, old layers, completely graffitied and cracked walls. What's going on? One of my colleagues asked. He seemed scared. I could see Wallace was also startled, looking over his shoulders and breathing rapidly. Listen, there's nothing fun about what you're doing. In 7 years teaching, I have never expelled someone from my classroom, but if you keep... Wallace was saying, but he stopped and gasped. Someone, no, something, was coming towards the camera from the end of the main corridor. It was wearing a completely white inmate suit, although the thing was so old that it was almost green. I couldn't see their face because of the darkness. Wallace, please kick him out, one of the students begged. Our teacher, now pale, kicked Lord Straxos out. I'm sorry this happened. I'll talk with the IT guy. Maybe someone hacked into our classroom or it was a glitch. There's no way that person could enter the classroom. He's not on the list. And only I can send invites to people outside it. He looked around himself again, obviously uncomfortable. Well, I'll continue the class on Pythagoras. His voice was interrupted by the sound the server makes when someone joins in, but it wasn't one person. Dozens and dozens of people started joining uninterruptedly. They all had nicknames entirely composed of random numbers and letters, and no one spoke or had their video activated. What the fuck? Wallace cursed. He never had done this before, and then I saw it. The person of the intruding video. Behind him, wearing that run-down asylum costume and holding a syringe. His face was... He had the same face of our professor, but rotten. Like he had been dead for days and his face was slowly rotting and ceasing to exist. Maybe we should stop the class, Wallace said. Wallace, on your side. I activated my microphone and spoke, but it was too late. The video stopped, but we heard the stab, and then a lot of static and glitchy noises. I tried to disconnect, not knowing what to do, but then all these people who joined started turning on their cams. They all had the faces of Wallace, but each one more and more grotesque, like several photos of a increasingly decomposed body. I grabbed my phone and tried to ask if someone was seeing what I was, but WhatsApp wouldn't load. I turned off my computer and the screen, but the images wouldn't go away. They were looking at me in the eyes. I then unplugged the computer to no avail. Now, let's start the class. all of them said in unison. And then I heard someone climbing my stairs, running. The house where I was alone, or so I thought. I hid myself inside my bathroom and tried to call the police, but I couldn't. I ended up crouching on the corner of the toilet and crying, hoping that whoever broke into the house wouldn't notice me. The bathroom door also had no lock, so if that person entered, I'd be helpless. I stayed there for around 10 minutes, hearing footsteps of someone running around and looking for me. Luckily, my toilet is built like its door was part of the wardrobe, so whoever was sprinting throughout my house did not manage to find me. The footsteps stopped. I looked at my phone. I had connection again. There were YouTube notifications coming in. I immediately called the police and went to WhatsApp to tell my parents someone had broken into the house and to check if my classmates were okay. There were a few mentions of the abandoned hospital thing, but they said that after the teacher kicked Lord out of the class went on without problems for some 10 minutes and then ended. Some of the students said that they didn't even see the shadows or the asylum at all, and that the class went normally for them. And then one of them said, "Guys, what the fuck are you talking about? Is this a joke? Haven't you read his message on the other group?" That's when I read Wallace's message on our teacher-student group. "Sorry, I won't be able to teach today. It's a unfamiliar emergency. I will be back next Monday." He had sent the message at 7:34. The dreaded night shift. I work from 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. as a custodian for a large bank headquarters. One I'd rather not say, but it's located in Michigan in a pretty open area. There are no other buildings nearby and it's connected to a curved road leading to the highway. Every shift, I drive up to the parking lot, hit my weed pen a couple of times and go in. For break, around 8 p.m., I go back to my car and it's straight to the pen and I open my cooler to eat lunch. Weed just makes the job easier. But now, no amount of weed could help me escape this. Recently, there have been reports of employees of the bank going missing. The front desk lady, Jasmine, was the one who told me. I'm the only custodian there for 6 hours until Jeremy comes in for his graveyard shift, and she speaks with me frequently. I feel bad for Jeremy, even though I clean most of the building, and he basically sits around in the receiving room on the computer for hours at a time. It's still desolate in there, and I'd be going nuts if I were him. Regardless of that, during the course of time throughout the rumors of people going missing, Jeremy has told me he wants to quit now. When I asked why, he just went pale and said he just doesn't feel comfortable here. Needless to say, he quit just 2 days ago, and now my hours are from 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. Great. Anyway, the following day I woke up with a sinking feeling in my chest, as I am the only janitor there now. My boss only contacts me through my phone. I haven't seen her in months, but she still writes my paychecks, so that's good, right? During the shift, I noticed several of the bank employees were absolutely shaken. One woman kept looking over her shoulder and jumping into a plant, causing it to fall over, and I had to clean it. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Matt. Here, let me help you." I politely interrupted her. No, it's okay. It's my job." I tried to be as cheerful as I could. "Hey, is there something wrong? I mean, I know of the situation, but you seem like there's something very wrong." I asked. Her eyes widened, and I could see sweat on her forehead. She leaned in closer to me, then whispered with intensity, "You need to get out of here while you can. This place is just wrong. That's what's wrong." I nodded with a confused look, and she just sighed and walked away. Now, I don't know about you, but that bothered me. What did she mean by that? The next day is how I found out what she meant. It was around 1 a.m. when I began to hear a noise coming from the stairs leading to the lower levels. Why a bank has 2 lower levels is what always crossed my mind. I remember specifically being told that the elevator doesn't go all the way down to the 2nd level, but I don't need to bother with that area. I found out what was down there. Once I noticed everyone leaving at 6 p.m., I decided to go down. The sounds appeared to be human voices, and sometimes I'd hear screams. I got to the first basement level and everything seemed fine. It was just a dark, open area with a bunch of tables and chairs. Probably all the shit they don't use anymore, but have nowhere to put. It was when I got to the second basement level where I decided that I need a new job, or to call the authorities. The door at the bottom of the staircase was chained with a padlock. I shouted, Is anyone in there? No response. Hello? I can hear you in there. Tried again. For a moment there were no noises. Then I waited longer and nothing happened. As soon as I turned around to head back up, there was a voice on the other side of the door. Is anyone in there? I turned around. The voice seemed disgruntled and sounded like they needed help. It was a low, woman's voice. She had to have been at least 60. Hold on, I'm going to open the door. I shouted and fumbled through my keys to see if I can find the according key that fit the lock. I kept trying to plunge random keys into the padlock with no avail. Hold on, I'm going to open the door. The voice commanded. I backed away in horror. The voice was not from a woman anymore. It was mine. As if the person was trying to copy me, but it was eerily similar to my voice. I kept staring at the door, quickly realizing that there was a reason the door was chained. Let me out. I then heard a wet splash hit the floor from the other side. I looked down at the door and blood was pooling from underneath. Long bony fingers were slowly coming out from under the door. I jumped and dropped the keys, ran up those stairs, called my supervisor frantically, telling her there is something wrong here, and clocked out. I called the police in my car and informed them on the blood. They took my info and said they would send some people. Eventually, 2 squad cars pulled up and I told them what happened. They asked if I could lead them to the area, and I did. The blood was gone, as well as the keys. My heart sank to my stomach, and the cops told me I was lucky I'm just a night shifter, and they figured I got spooked from being there at night for so long and left. I didn't care. I'm not going back in there. I called my supervisor and quit right there. They could send someone else to deal with that shit. I sped home and didn't even care about the consequences. But I wish I took more care in grabbing those keys or something, because right now, there's a person outside my door. They keep repeating the words in my voice. Is someone there? Hold on. I'm going to open the door. I had the television on, and the girl that bumped into the plant, Melissa, was now missing. I am thinking about calling the police again, but what are they going to do? Is this thing going to be standing there when they come? Will they even come at all? I haven't bothered to look through the peephole yet, but whatever this thing is, it said and did something that made my chest sink. First, it spoke. Hey, Matt, I'm all right. Just let me in. It wasn't that old woman's voice anymore, or mine. It was Melissa. What is this thing? I then heard the distinct sound of keys jingling. Then in a low, warbling voice it said, I'm out. Please, open the door. When you are young, you're asked what you want to be when you grow up. Some people will say policeman or a fireman, and they can pursue those goals. Other kids will say that they want to be a superhero or a knight or something outlandish. However, they manage to go ahead and find a path towards something they enjoy. And then there were kids like myself who said that they want to be an astronaut. Sure, some kids say that, and then come up with another idea shortly afterwards. Unfortunately for me, I was too stubborn. God bless my parents, as they wanted to encourage me, and I can remember this as I was around 14 years old. We lived in the great state of Florida in a small town called Sharp, and we weren't that far from the Kennedy Space Center. I can remember driving down to the center or some of the small beaches that were around to watch the launches of various rockets, and of course the space shuttle in the early 80s. However, something happened in the late 80s that dulled my interest in the space program. Part of it had to be with school as I was getting ready to get into high school. However, the other part had to be when I had gotten my first computer. It was a Commodore 64, and believe me when I tell you, I had gotten lost in the games that were coming out for this machine. I still remember the print ads saying that this was more than a glorified gaming console. If that was the case, then why were some of the best games for the time released on the Commodore 64? I still think these ads were put out to make mommy and daddy buy the computer and to tell them, look, it can do more than play games. Heck, I even remember playing the Bard's Tale on this machine when I was home from school for some reason. The television was playing in the background as they covered another shuttle launch. However, things didn't pan out so well for the ill-fated Challenger mission. I don't think I even watched more than a few minutes as the nation watched in horror, as the lives of the Challenger crew were snuffed out. As time passed, I skated on by in my grades and went from grade to grade without any difficulty. I had to start thinking about what college to attend, if I wanted to go, and all the problems that came along with it. Part of me wanted to join the military. However, my father squashed that idea outright, saying he would disown me if I signed up. The reason behind that is when he lived in Manhattan during the Korean War, he had signed up to enlist. However, his parents, along with the intervention of some priests, managed to get him a cushy assignment on Governor's Island. He had spent his tour of duty not far from his house and working as an accountant, carving out a great life for himself and his family. One story I fondly remember was a ranking officer trying to muscle past my father, and the officer was dressed as a civilian. He told this man to show him his credentials and sign the logbook, and he had refused to do so. As this officer put a foot on the bottom step, my father pulled out his 1911 and said, "Sir, if you do not come back here and sign, I will shoot you." Grumbling, the man came back and showed him his badge. A general no less, and he signed in. He was commended for doing a great job the next day by his superior. Sitting down at the dining room table, I scanned the instructions for my college application. One of the parts was to write an essay about an interesting person that you had met. I was 16 years old, had never left the state of Florida, and never really hung out with more than the same 6 friends that I had since grade school. My mom looked at the mess and told me to clear the table for dinner. When she saw the troubled look on my face, she asked me what was up. "Do we have anyone interesting in our family? I mean, I know you've done things as well as Dad, but I need a great idea for this piece for my college application." "Why not try your uncle? He's not far from here and he's always home. Give him a call." Picking up the rotary phone, I dialed his number, and at first it just rang and rang. When I was about to hang up, I heard the click of the receiver as someone had picked up.
"Hello?"
A slurred voice answered. "Yeah, this is your nephew. I was hoping that you could help me with something for college."
Sure. Come by tomorrow, about noon. Don't come early, you hear?
"I won't, and thank you for..." Then he hung up on me. Letting out a sigh, part of me wondered if this was a big mistake. Getting a good night's sleep along with a good breakfast helped curb some of that doubt. However, before 11 o'clock, the doubt and fear resurfaced. Shaking my head to clear it and assembling the items needed for this interview, which were a notebook, pens, and a cassette recorder, and I was ready for the day. The address my uncle had given me led me to a property that wasn't far from the railroad tracks. To say that this place was unkempt was an understatement, as you couldn't tell where the lawn ended and the surrounding vegetation began. A few rusted cars littered the front yard, and it was a miracle that this man hadn't been fined for these infractions. Even laying my bike in the tall grass, you couldn't even tell that it was there. Making my way up the barely visible walkway to the front door of the house almost looked like an abandoned derelict. The front windows were boarded up, the white paint peeling from the rotted wood, and the security gates over the front door was a rusted, dull black. Part of me wanted to run away and forget about this whole assignment and start from scratch. However, curiosity, as well as a need to get this assignment done, won out in the end as I knocked loudly. The door flew open, and a wild-eyed man in his early 40s answered the door. He was dressed in a stained Florida Gators t-shirt, ripped jeans, and was completely barefoot, brandishing a baseball bat that had various nicks and stains on it, as if he looked at me ready to swing. Then he visibly relaxed as he recognized me and remembered about the interview we had talked about just yesterday. "Oh, it's you. Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. Please come in." Trembling, I had to wonder if this was a good idea, and part of me wanted to go home and play on my computer. However, this had to get done in order for me to get into a good college, so I followed him inside. Light streamed in from between the boarded windows as my nose was assaulted by a myriad of smells. The most prevalent were the scent of cheap beer and stale sweat, as this place didn't need a cleaning. It needed to be condemned. The carpeted floor was barely visible with all the debris that was scattered about, from discarded bits from newspapers to assorted wrappers from fast and other foods. This place could use a squad of housekeepers to clean up the place. I could also see the kitchen as we passed by, as the pile of dirty dishes that were in the sink, some with food stuck to them still. Flies buzzed around this feast as they feasted on rotted food on the countertops and table. He led me to a spare room, where it looked nicer than the rest of the house, and the carpet could be seen. The room was sparsely furnished, with a small card table and chairs, and this room smelled cleaner than the rest of the house. My uncle motioned me to go inside and closed the door after us. "Sorry about the mess," he offhandedly remarked. "It's the maid's day off." I chuckled and laid out my required tools on the tabletop, setting up the recorder as he looked at me suspiciously. "Oh, this is to help me with my notes for my essay." He stared at the tape recorder as he nodded. "And you'll destroy it after you're done?" "Of course." The tape was never destroyed. It sat in a drawer long forgotten, as fate would put it back in my hands 20 years later. I want to play this tape for you guys, and you can come to your own conclusions, as if he was truthful or not. I bleeped out some of the information so it cannot be tracked back to him. I'm also going to add some notes that don't come across the audio recordings, such as facial expressions or body language. "Please state your name in the report." "My name is..." "And you're doing this report for a college application, correct?" "That's correct. And the subject was to interview an interesting person to tell me about yourself." He looked wistful, as if recalling a fond memory from his past. "When I was young like you, the only thing that made me happy was fantasizing about flying. Other kids used to ask me, 'What are you going to be when you're older?' And I said a superhero without missing a beat. That would usually get laughs from the other kids, as part of me thought they were real. It was a harsh lesson to learn, so instead, I decided to focus on my studies to get into the armed forces." His face turned to a scowl. "After high school, I went into the armed forces and signed up to be in the Air Force. Other cadets thought they had made it, as they had their dad's legacy to carry out. Me? I was out on my own and had to work twice as hard to get my butt in that cockpit. Pushing myself harder than ever before, I managed to secure a spot in the 33rd. The 33rd? The 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing, flying out of the best aircraft known to men at the time. I was an Eagle driver, and there was nothing that machine couldn't do. This was a multi-role fighter that could do both air-to-air combat, as well as ground support and anything in between. However, the conflict, if you can call it that, lasted weeks instead of years. Hell, I didn't even fire a shot, as we were sent in to cover our boys on the ground. After the time spent over Grenada, one of my superiors wanted to recommend me for a special project. A new type of aircraft was being developed, and it was my job to put it through his paces. You ever heard of the X-29, kid? I shook my head no. Pity. The aircraft was sweeter than honey, as it could maneuver rings around the F-15. It had a fly-by-wire system that meant the computer helped pilot the aircraft. It was that complicated, and only a handful of pilots could manage to fly her. Day after day, it was put through test after test, and where other pilots failed, I managed to succeed, So much in fact that this guy met me on the tarmac and told me he was from NASA. Wait, NASA? They wanted to train you? Be an astronaut? He finished. Yup. 2 weeks later, I was put into an accelerated training program to learn how to fly the space shuttle. Days seemed to meld together as the routine would be wake up, do exercise, eat, and then spend countless hours in a simulator. That was my entire world for over a year. No breaks, no vacation, no nothing. After 2 years of training, they wanted to train me to do an EVA. You have heard of that, right? I nodded. Now, before the mission I was on, all of the EVAs were tethered to the shuttle, meaning the pilot had to be close to whatever was being worked on. That was a pain in the ass for both pilot and the sucker doing the EVA. However, I was being trained on their new manned maneuvering unit, but not in space as it was the NASA center in. They'd put us in a pool for hours on end, and we'd train on how to maneuver in space and work with tools. It was kind of fun, actually. After a year or so, they told me in 3 weeks my first mission would be up. It was... And I can remember the launch date was. And the reason that this was so hush-hush is it was part for the Department of Defense. We asked what the payload was, and we were simply told don't ask. Day of the launch, and I am as jittery as a teenager doing his first driving test. I checked and rechecked every system at least 3 times, and I was the co-pilot. The skies were so blue, it was something out of a beach movie, and not even a stiff breeze. Control called it optimal launch conditions, and at a little after 10 a.m. we were going to launch. I cannot even begin to explain what it's like to be launched into space. Have you ever been on an express elevator, kid? I shook my head no. Then there's no way I can describe what it's like to be launched into space. Your guts are in your feet. Everything is shaking as you are propelled out of the atmosphere. After around 8 minutes or so, you're in orbit and you can feel your butt leave the seat. It's a trippy feeling, let me tell you, as you knew you were in space. All I could do was nod. When you can see the curvature of the Earth in a few countries at a single glance, you are left in awe. We only spent around an hour or so in orbit before we had gotten into position to release our payload. I suited up for an EVA that had to be done in order to turn on some functions of this payload. What was the payload? He stopped for a minute and thought as if deciding how to break the news to a kid there wasn't a Santa Claus. This was an experimental platform that served to be a deterrent against any threats against the United States, either foreign or domestic. I looked confused, but my uncle just looked at me with a grin. Like the Star Wars program? He gave me a stern look, but gave me a wink as if to say, I cannot confirm or deny that statement. Anyway, the thing they don't tell you about being in space is how quiet and empty it is. The only thing you hear in your helmet is your own breathing and the communication from the radio. Setting up the payload took roughly an hour, as I had to run a few diagnostics to make sure this thing was set up correctly. That's when I saw it out of the corner of my eye. His features looked clouded for a moment, as if trying to remember something. I remember it was a crystal a little bigger than a Mack truck with a trailer attached. It wasn't huge, but this thing wasn't exactly small. It was completely black, and I only caught a glimpse of it as a stray ray of sunlight bounced off it. I was going to contact Mission Control to tell them what it was, however. I wanted to see for myself. That was foolish. His head was bowed as if ashamed of something he had done. Using the MMU, I moved up to the crystal, as I couldn't see anything past its reflective surface. I went ahead and touched my glove to the sheer surface and I blacked out. I was on Earth, and it was a week later as they had found me floating in space as they had to rescue me. I told them what had happened, and they looked at me funny as they pulled the recordings from the helmet cam. There wasn't anything out there, my commanding officer said. I'm not sure what happened to you, but at one point, you were working on the payload, and the next you were floating out towards nothing. The crew called you multiple times until they had to organize a rescue party to come get you. As he continued to tell the story, he looked even more visibly shaken. After leaving the hospital, there was a constant feeling of uneasiness when I was outside. On clear days, it was less pronounced. However, on a cloudy day, it was worse. Especially where there were clouds that were dark gray and seemed like a rolling sea. My mind would play tricks as if seeing glimpses of a giant creature that looked down on all of us. There were, of course, constant inquiries from NASA and the military, and of course I retold the same story over and over. They discharged me with a Section 8, however. They let me keep my pension and gave me enough to buy this piece of property. That, along with the stipend I get from the government, keeps me here as I don't go outside much anymore. Everything is either delivery or dropped off right at my front door. My uncle started to sweat as he looked at me, stricken with horror. I did touch something out there. I have no idea what it was, but it wasn't nothing. You have to believe me. Say that you believe me. Say it. I believe you. My uncle visibly relaxed after I said that as he slumped in his chair. I think I need to go lie down, kiddo. If you could show your way out and close the door, that would be great. Sweeping all of the items into a bag, I rushed out of the house, grabbing my bike and pedaling for my life to go back home. My mom called after me, asking how it went, and I made up some lies saying that he wasn't home and decided to go for a ride. She shrugged. Well, you'll find someone interesting to write about, and you'll get into college. Don't worry about it. I wound up writing about my father and his experiences on Governor's Island, and that managed to get me into a great school. As time went on, I forgot about the tape and thought that was the end of it, as there was a little bit left. I decided to listen towards the end, and there were minutes of silence and static, but that isn't what scared me. It made me just as paranoid as my uncle. What has terrified me is the twisted parody of my uncle's voice on the end of the tape. And I will play it for you. You may have forgotten us. However, we haven't forgotten you. We are always here, just beyond your reach. We are always watching, and someday soon, we will return to lord over all mankind, just like we did thousands of years ago. And you cannot, will not, stop us. In 1925, a man named Julius Slaughter found himself traveling in the northeastern United States on behalf of his employer, who worked as an investor in the booming stock market of the era. He was particularly good at his job. In fact, he was regarded as one of the best and most convincing negotiators by anyone that had met him. He'd been to Chicago, New York, Seattle, Los Angeles, the whole shebang, and that was his entire life. He talked to company after company and moved across the continental United States to help grow this empire. And by the age of 53, he had never taken a wife, settled anywhere permanently, or had any children. He lived his life on the road. Julius's last known whereabouts were in a small town in western Massachusetts. One cold November day, he rode a train like he had hundreds of times before, on the railway that he knew so well. But the train wasn't on track towards its destination. It was on the railroad heading towards the Twilight Zone. Sorry, no it wasn't. Just thought that would be funny. But he really did go missing. Julius sat in the seat with his briefcase sitting on the table in front of him. The booth was empty save for himself, but he was well used to that by now. Some days he would find that he was lonelier than he would have liked, but the work kept him busy. Often enough, too busy to bother with such fantasies. His goal was clear. Get in and get the signatures. That was all. And he knew how to do it, too. He'd done it countless times before. He knew how to sweet-talk people, and he knew how to get what he wanted. He watched as the brown scenery whipped across his field of view and off into the distance behind him. Always looking forward, He scanned the interior of the car as people sat in their booths and either talked quietly to each other or stared out the window like himself. When the train pulled into the station, the sun was already dipping below the horizon despite the time being only half past 4 o'clock. Julius despised the winter months, and even now, as he stepped off the steam engine, he could feel the turn of the season in the air. He shuddered as the cold seeped through his coat and into his bones. He dreaded the thought that he might have to be here for more than 3 days. Julius wasted no time. There were no cabs in this dreary town, so he had to walk the distance from the station to the motel. But the distance wasn't far. Longer than the man would have liked, but not bad. The town was quaint, but Julius disliked the atmosphere. He preferred the big city over the simple life of the townsfolk that he looked down on. He couldn't imagine why the company had chosen to meet here when it was based in Boston. At least in Boston he could endure the cold and relative comfort. He turned his head to the opposite side of the road, where the forest loomed into the darkening sky. Somehow, he felt uncomfortable. Something about the dark shadows, the thick foliage. It was the opposite of civilization, something he couldn't control. Emptiness rose in front of him. Julius came upon the motel and had himself checked into the largest room they had. It wasn't impressive, but he would have to settle. He was used to it at this point. The first night, he tossed and turned in the cold, trying to find a way to keep himself warm with the broken radiator. The next morning, he reported the problem to staff and went on his way to meet with the company. They were initially hesitant to buy what he was selling, so to speak. But after a while of talking them down, he was able to arrange a second meeting in which he knew he would be able to convince them. He would be out of there before he knew it. Julius entered his motel room with a brand new functioning radiator. He was in considerably better spirits than he had been the day before. He moved to the window and drew the curtains, only to be greeted with a view of the trees just on the other side of the street. He decided he would head out to eat. The second night, Julius found himself dreaming. He was standing in a field of grass dotted with varying trees. All around him were skyscrapers, taller than he had ever seen, and yet none of them seemed inhabited. The streets lay empty, lights turned out, papers fluttered by with the leaves. Pushed on a cold autumn breeze, snow began to fall. Looking around, Julius could see that he was in what appeared to be New York, but not as he had ever known it to be. The concrete jungle seemed to be transforming into a botanical one. Vines grew up hundreds of feet along brick walls, and grass sprouted from cracks in the road. Cars lay abandoned and broken along the sidewalks, while trees stuck up from the interiors. The park in which he was standing was heavily overgrown, with weeds and bushes covering the ground. And then, before his eyes, the world began to grow. Trees cracked and groaned with age as they expanded and reached high above him. The skyscrapers began to crumble, leaving in their wake more sprouting trees. Grass grew and broke apart the asphalt until nothing was left but dirt and leaves. Inside Julius was an intense feeling of dread. All around him, the civilized world crumbled and left in its wake a giant, breathing forest which was wholly unfamiliar. Wind blew through the trunks of the enormous trees and chilled him to the bone. This was a bizarre environment. Never had he seen a forest such as this. The trunks of the trees were warped and black, and the dead leaves on the ground withered as if burned. Something moved in the woods. Julius swung around and began breathing heavily. He knew something was out there. Something beyond the touch of man stretched endlessly into the dark void, and it was moving. The man woke up in a cold sweat. The radiator shuddered next to him. Through the window, Julius could see an orange light creeping underneath the curtain. Another day. He promptly forgot about his dreams and began preparing for work. The second day he managed to score with the company's representatives. They celebrated at a local bar. The day passed through his mind without a second thought. After all, it was just another day on the job. Today he would be here. Tomorrow he might be on a train to Miami. The only certainty was that he would be working. His thoughts returned to the peculiar dream. It seemed so silly now, to be scared by your own imagination. But even now, as he looked out the window and into the trees, he felt himself growing increasingly uneasy, as if something truly was out there. "You all right, friend?" Julius snapped out of his daze. "Oh, Yeah, of course. I'm swell. We've made great progress today, haven't we? A reason to celebrate, I'm sure. He raised a glass. The two other men clinked them together. Look, Julius, the man said with his scruffy voice. I've got a friend coming into town the day after the next. Like me, he's got an independent business that could use some financing. What do you say? Julius agreed to stay a few more days and talk it out with the company. He'd just need to send a telegram to his employer. On the way back to the motel, Julius glanced over at the trees. Through his crystallizing breath, he could see just how dark this place could get without the aid of human industrialization. Anything could be out there. He shivered and continued on his way. That night he couldn't sleep. He found himself staring at the window despite the curtain being drawn. Faint light of the street lamps outside seeped through, casting a shadow on the ground before his bed. Time ticked by. He stared at the window. Eventually, he fell asleep. The dream resumed. Julius was back in the woods. Whatever was out there was certainly moving his way. It took every fiber of his being to stand still, and yet he couldn't help himself from stumbling backwards and staring blindly into the dark ahead. Snow drifted through the branches and came to rest on his head and shoulders. Whatever it was very large, and moving slowly. A lumbering giant, a creature of the forest itself. It came closer, closer, always closer. He could feel the ground sway under his feet. He collapsed and shook uncontrollably. It was just a dream. Only a dream. It was almost upon him now, and he could almost see something massive in the trees ahead. If he closed his eyes, it might go away. He might wake up. Julius opened them again and saw nothing there. Empty woods once more. For a moment he felt safe. Sheer force of will had saved him. 4 glowing orbs of light appeared 30 feet up, arranged in a trapezoidal shape. Julius opened his eyes and found himself staring at the spot of light on the motel carpeting once again. His fear eased. His fear surged. In the center of the spot was an area of relative darkness that hadn't been there before. Something was blocking the light outside his window. Julius tiptoed out of bed and tiptoed across the floor to the side of the window, trying to look through it to see if he could make out what it was. The curtain was too thick. He reached out with shaking fingers and pinched the folds. 3, 2, 1. He jerked the curtain out of the way to reveal nothing. The shadow on the floor was gone. Julius convinced himself he had been seeing things. He needed out of this godforsaken town. The next day, Julius had time on his hands. He spent the day filling out paperwork and left the motel room when he had found that he'd completed it all. He used the spare time to explore the downtown area. Although compared to the cities he'd been to, this place seemed like farmland. There was little shopping to be done and even fewer forms of entertainment. He used this time to sweet talk to a local young lady into spending the evening with him. When night came, he had his way and ditched her, heading back to the hotel for another restless sleep. The dreams this night did not continue. Instead, he found himself staring through the open window, not willing to close his eyes and not willing to move. The radiator crackled somewhere far off, and the wind shook the building around him, swaying the branches of the trees. Eventually, Julius climbed out of bed and walked to the window. It was, as he suspected. Someone was out there, standing at the tree line and barely illuminated by the lamp. They stood motionless, staring at Julius, he was sure. But why? He couldn't know. Julius moved to the door and swung it open. Frozen air rushed in and surrounded him, making him shudder, but his eyes remained on the stranger by the trees. He stepped out and began to walk towards them. As he approached the road, the individual's features became more clear. He was tall, slightly taller than Julius, and wearing a custom-tailored black suit. He was bald, but other than the rest of his facial features, were obscure. Julius stopped in the road across from him and stared. For a minute, nobody made any attempt at communication. Then Julius called out to him. No response. Hey, mister, you'd better listen here. Who do you think you are, standing out here like this? What do you want, The man shifted. Show yourself, stranger. I don't have time for your lollygagging. The man moved forward into the light. All at once, Julius realized that this was, in fact, not a man. Or rather, not a man anymore, if it had been at one point. It was a pale red, and had a large round head maybe twice that of a normal person. There was no lower jaw, but there were teeth on the upper jaw that looked roughly like that of a human's. 2 beady black eyes sat at odd angles on its face, and 2 nostrils sat similarly just below them. Extending out from under its sleeves were 5 long, spindly fingers arranged in a circular pattern, ending in short, jagged claws. Its feet were long and angled, like that of a deer or bird's, with long toes including one in the back for balance. Julius stumbled backwards and fell. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'm sorry." The thing stared. Julius climbed back on his feet without taking his eyes off the monster. Then, in one motion, swung around and sprinted back towards his motel room, slamming the door shut behind him and pressing his back against it. He was shaking all over and could feel tears forming in his eyes. He moved to the window and looked out. Nothing. He hadn't imagined it. He couldn't have. Could he? He felt as if he was losing his mind. He needed a change of scenery, and fast. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. He drew the curtain and fell to the floor, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. What was happening to him? Julius didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning he had to meet with the company. Perhaps he was losing his touch, or maybe they could see the lack of sleep in his eyes. But it took rather more convincing to get them on his side. By the end of the day, he still hadn't succeeded, but was confident in his ability and knew he could be done the next day. If not, then he would surely be out of there the day after next. 2 more nights. He had to stay 2 more nights. Looking for other hotels was a goose chase. There was nothing nearby. Besides, even if he did swap hotels, then what if the tormenting thing didn't stop? The thought that he might truly be going mad scared him more than whatever was out there could. Julius waited until well after nightfall to check for the return of the monster. He hadn't changed out of his clothes and was still dressed to impress, so to speak. His coat was sufficient to keep him relatively warm as long as he wasn't out there too long. He moved to the window at 11:30 and saw the thing waiting out there for him. He mustered the courage and headed out into the dark. The 2 stood where they had the previous night, staring at each other. At first, nothing happened. Julius was too afraid to try speaking to it again, lest he might agitate the creature. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Neither moved from their spot. Julius was about to give up. The being shifted in place. Then, as if wanting Julius to follow it, moved backwards into the dark slowly. "What? Is this a game to you?" It waited. Julius grumbled to himself and reluctantly crossed the street. The creature continued its descent into the woods. Following about 30 feet behind it, Julius moved into the underbrush. Amazingly, there seemed to be almost a natural path where the branches and plants were absent, allowing him to move unhindered and without risking corrosion or tearing to his clothes. They moved deeper. Behind Julius, the light of the street lamps faded, leaving only the light of the waning moon seeping through the branches to guide him. Time passed slowly. How long had they been traveling? 30 minutes? How much farther would they need to go before they reached the end of the path? Julius wondered where it might be taking him to. He hadn't the slightest clue. What could something so inhuman, so horribly demonic want to do with him? Perhaps it didn't want him specifically. Maybe it was like a lion on the hunt. Julius could be the prey. Absently, he toyed with the idea that there might be no end to this trail. The woods seemed to grow thicker and thicker. What could possibly be out here? Nothing, Julius thought. There was nothing out here. He was following a horrible beast to his death. The air seemed to grow colder. Each passing minute brought with it ever-decreasing temperature and new waves of fear. He was reminded of his dream. He felt as if something was out there, something massive and something malevolent. He shook uncontrollably and could no longer will his feet to move. The creature continued on. Julius snapped and whipped around. He couldn't do this anymore. He had to escape. He sprinted back the way he had come, dashing through the overgrown branches of a path that had just previously been free of debris. But he didn't care. He allowed the trees to rake across his clothes, his skin. He shredded his shoes, sprinting through the frozen dirt. Escape. Escape was all he could feel. He needed to flee. Something was following him. He was sure of it. And if he stopped moving, even for an instant, he would be dead. He crashed through to the other side nearly 15 minutes later, panting and wheezing. There was nothing behind him. He learned, and everything seemed the same as it was. He limped into the hotel room and promptly ejected the contents of his stomach. The narrative breaks down at this point. From what I can gather from the chicken scratch of his journal and official police reports, Julius didn't show up the next day to his meetings. Instead, he paced around the hotel room, thinking. His mental state began deteriorating quickly at this point. Half the writing is illegible, and the other half is repeated words and phrases like whispering woods and return. His final entry reads as follows. The trees whisper in the wind. Oh, the whispering woods call to me. Why is it that the most uncivilized, the most horrendous horticulture of God lies in my mind? That the tall trees with their branches extended seem to be reaching for me. There is nothing there tonight, nothing that can be viewed in the eyes of man. But perhaps, with the aid of that which is not, I can be taught to see what is invisible. I hear the voices in my mind of eons past. Tremendous monstrosities gurgle their will to me. The whispering woods call to me, opening the path to freedom, freedom from obligation, freedom from love, freedom from the fear of death and the pain of life. There is a way to enlightenment. I have seen it. The way lies in the path ahead, opening up for me to enter, where the sins and struggles of mankind take physical form, and the beasts of the subconscious roam free. The way is clear to me now. The woods offers its darkness to those who can learn its secrets, and to those that can feel no pain. Julius was reported missing the morning after when the hotel staff found his room vacated of everything but his belongings. No trace of him was ever found. Well, not until I discovered this journal in the woods. Sometime in the night, he dropped the book. Incredibly, I managed to find it purely on accident. Which direction he went, I can't really be sure. But I'm getting closer to unlocking the secrets of this place. One day, I'm going to find out where all those missing persons disappeared to. I don't know why now seems like the right time to tell my story. I've pushed it so far back in my mind that it almost feels like a movie I've seen instead of a real-life experience. Please be patient and bear with me. It's hard for me to relive this, let alone type it. When I was 14, me and my little brother shared a room. He was 8. We never really got along. The age difference and sharing a small room didn't help, but worst of all was that Aiden had to sleep with a nightlight. Drove me insane. He could sleep with it, but I couldn't. I begged my parents to take it away, but they refused until we had such a fight over it that I ended up hitting Aiden. I felt awful. My parents were furious, but after a few nights of getting the cold shoulder off Aiden, he said he would settle with leaving our room door open a crack to let some light from the hall in. All was going great for once. It was probably the 4th night of no nightlight when I woke up to hear Aiden sobbing. I looked over at his bed. He had the blanket over his head, and I figured he was just scared of the dark. Again, I feel awful saying this, but I just turned over and went back to sleep. We were raised by a strict dad who would tell us boys don't cry. The next morning, Aiden was quieter than usual. Mom didn't seem to notice, or Dad. Not that Dad would notice if we chopped all our hair off anyway. They were always busy. Later, when we came home from school, Aiden was even more off. He didn't eat his dinner and barely spoke. I asked him if someone at school was making fun of him, and he scoffed at me. Annoyed, I let him sulk. For the next week, his attitude got worse. He even started ignoring our dad. I thought he must have a death wish. He was punished, but I'd rather not talk about that. When we went to bed, I felt bad for Aiden. I asked him what was up and if everything was okay. He said I wouldn't understand. I told him try me. He simply sat up in the bed and looked me dead in the eyes and said this is something you won't understand. After threatening to tell Dad something was wrong, he still wouldn't tell me. I came to the conclusion he is going mad. Not even our dad scared him anymore. That night, I woke up to the feeling of ice cold on the back of my neck, and instantly a gut-wrenching feeling came over me. The kind of feeling where you know something is wrong. I was petrified and I didn't know why. I dared not move, and after what felt like a lifetime, the feeling disappeared. I finally got the courage to turn around, but I dared not open my eyes fully. As I squinted, the room seemed normal. Nothing was there. Nothing out of place. I got braver and opened my eyes fully. All was well. I put it down to a bad dream, and went to go back to sleep when I noticed Aiden's bed was empty. It was strange. He rarely got up alone to use the bathroom or get some water. He would normally wake me or just wait till morning because he was a scaredy cat. I got up and went to his bed. Nothing. So I walked around the house and I couldn't find him. I was starting to panic now. I was freaking out. I knew something was wrong. I went back to our room and turned on the light. Nothing was gone. He hadn't ran away. As I looked around, I noticed a piece of paper under his bed, which, again, is unusual. Very strict dad equals no mess, no excuses. When I picked it up, I thought for sure he had ran away. But when I read the note, my whole body went numb. I could only feel my stomach churning like a washing machine. I wish I could just upload a photo of it because typing it out reminds me it's real. Bill, I don't know when I'll be gone, but I think it will be soon. I'm really sorry for being weird lately. I'm just trying to keep you safe. He watches you. He watches you sleep every night. And since I gave up my nightlight, I haven't been sleeping great, and that's when I first seen him. He was standing over you. I thought we were being robbed and I went to call for Mom and Dad, but he turned around and seen me. He told me if I cried, he would kill us both. And if I told anyone, he would kill Mom and Dad too. I panicked and hid under the covers. I really thought it was a bad dream and I didn't want anyone thinking I was a baby. The next night he came back and now he watches me. I pretend I'm asleep, but I think he knows. I don't know how he gets in. I never hear the door open or anything. He's just there. I think he's afraid of the light. I tried leaving the door open a bit more to let more light in, but Dad always closes it. He gets into my dreams. He showed me what will happen to us if we try to scream. He brings us to a barn, but it's not a barn I know of. It's cold and there's other kids there too, but they all look like skeletons. I'm scared, Bill. I really think he will take us. I can't tell you because then he definitely will. I fell to the ground. This had to be a cruel prank. Payback for the years of torture I gave him. I tried to digest it all and flip the page over. The writing on the back was different. It was Aiden's, but it was more rushed. It simply said, "He came in my dreams. He's coming. He wants one of us. Whoever wakes up and looks at him first. Bill, I love you. I'm not going to pretend to be asleep tonight. I'm sorry for being annoying, and I know you hate the nightlight, but I think you'll need it. I think he's afraid of the light. The kids in the barn." That was it. The rest of the word descended into a line down the page. I really couldn't breathe at this stage, and I screamed and passed out. I woke up in hospital the next day to my mother crying at my bedside and my dad speaking with 2 police officers at the room door. He was telling them I wasn't ready and to come back. I was dazed. I didn't know what was going on. My mother seen me awake and immediately asked where was Aiden. I just cried and cried. I told her about the notes and that I had read it, but refused to believe it was nothing more than a story he was writing down for fun. I told them I found it and it wasn't there earlier. I told them about the ice-cold feeling on the back of my neck and the feeling of dread. They believed me. My dad knew I wouldn't dare lie to him. The police put it down to a kidnapping. They found no sign of forced entry and my parents were suspects for weeks. It really crippled our family. We had to move because neighbors gossiped that my dad flipped out and killed Aiden in a fit of rage, and we all covered it up. It's been 3 years now. My parents divorced. They couldn't deal with the grief together. I live mostly with my mom. We have never given up looking for Aiden, although I sometimes think how he might be alive. His letter made it sound like these kids were all alive, but barely. I don't know who took Aiden, but I know it couldn't be human. That feeling I got that night made me feel things I'll never feel again. I hope. I sleep with 2 nightlights now, just in case one breaks when I'm asleep. I wish I could say I hope Aiden reads this one day and can get home. But my heart tells me wherever he is, he can't escape. No one can. I love you, Aiden, and your nightlight. Bill. The chugging of tracks on the snowy railways, the pitter-patter of snow hitting the glass. I tried shuffling slightly across the seats. No one would mind if I slept. It's ghostly here. I drifted for a long time. If I were to look at myself in the mirror, I wouldn't guess that I was only 16 myself. Just a little longer, just a couple of seconds of shut-eye. The relief of rest abruptly taken by the slamming of a heavy door. Help! Can anyone help? A voice yelled from across the cart. I stammered to stand, nearly diving face first into the hard metallic floors at the same time. While I was straightening myself, I took a quick glance at the woman. Blood. Before I knew it, I was at the side of the woman, her arm a mangled mess of cloth and flesh. I opened my mouth, words getting caught in my throat. I coughed instead. What happened to her? What's happened to the others in the cart before her? Instead of asking questions, I should take her away from the door. I don't want what did that to her to finish the job, or take me out as well. I quickly dumped my bag to see if I can use something to get pressure on her arm. Medical gauze and a ruler will have to do. May I ask why you are carrying wrappings with you? Question that instead of worrying about your arm. I wanted to ask, but that would not be the correct thing to ask. I have to think of something to be able to talk with her. My phone. I pulled out my phone and opened it up and pushed the buttons down as fast as I could. May I ask what happened to you? Her face was a mess of hair and her eyebrows furrowing up, as if she couldn't understand. I pointed to my phone to get her attention, forcing it into her hand. Marks from her nails in the palm, focused on medical work. I was attacked, she spouted. I backed away a little as I was caught off guard by her sudden panic. By what? I typed, trying my best not to let go of the binding on her arm. I think it was a naked bear or something of the sort. It was skinny to the bone, and its arms were grotesque and abnormally long, nearly going down to its knees. She couldn't finish her thought. She was shaking at this point. The scariest thing is that when it opened its grotesque mouth, it didn't have a tongue. Her fear was emitting off her, her eyes full of terror. Where are the other people in the cart? I tried to hide my shaking hands, but it was obvious to both of us that she wasn't the only one scared. I finished securing the bandages. She still hasn't answered me. Then a thought came to mind. Where has the metallic clanking of the wheels gone? Rushing to the window, thrashing through curtains, the trees were still. Snow still falling slowly. Something must have happened to the conductor. The woman sputtered as she was cradling herself, like how a crazed person would in a mental hospital. I have to think of a way to calm her down. She will be helpless. I have to try and talk, even if it sounds like gears clunking around. It might at least calm her down if she knows I can respond even just a little. The words kept getting stuck in my throat. My attempts at calling her miss, thwarted by a throat of pins and needles. What about her question? I want to become a med student. I somehow got out the words. Still very broken, but understandable to her as she lit up just as I said them. That sounds like hard work. What about your voice? Don't you need to be able to speak to patients or teachers? She stumped me. I tried to talk once more, but it was a bit too painful, so I resorted back to my phone. At this point, I know that I've gotten her back to reality. We must get to the conductor cart. If we can get the conductor's cart, he should either be held up in his cart without fuel, or that thing got to him. But the conductor carts are reinforced, so if we get there, the people at the station should notice. How am I supposed to tell the woman, though? Would she even agree? I lost my thought. The door that I had latched was being caved in. The shrieking from the woman told me all that I needed to know. I can't type on my phone fast enough. Run. The next cart. I tugged at the woman's arm. She realized and stood up. Once I saw, I dragged her away, knowing that I can't move her attention away from the door. I pulled the door to the next cart open, frigid air rushing into my lungs as I did, the stain of my throat apparent. I pulled open the next door and threw myself and the woman into it. I rushed up as fast as I could and shut the door as hard as I could, not before seeing the skeletal face of the beast we just ran from. Hollow, sunken eyes, gray and white skin tight to its skull. Can such a thing even live in this cold? We're going to die. We're going to die in the cold and then be eaten by this thing and never be found again. She's lost it again. I can't just pull a common conversation and hope she'll be pulled out again. What's her name? Miss, you. Name what? I held back a cough and my throat was sore, but I had to get her and myself to safety. Anne. My name is Anne, she said with a smile. Mine's Larsh, I said, trying to imitate the smile she made. She laughed. What an unusual name. Nice to meet you. She put her hand out, grabbed it, shaking it like a proper greeting. Strange that I haven't asked of her name. I couldn't dwell on our strange meeting. I have to get me and Anne to safety. Anne, we need safe. Conductor cart safe. Please follow. I grasped her hand, praying that she'd understand. With a nod, we now know our common objective. We got up in haste, knowing that we took too long waiting in the cart. Surely the beast would have figured out that we had ran to the next cart. So as fast as we could move our legs, we sprinted to the next door. Then pulling it open, a large metallic clack would grab the attention of the beast. We heard the snarl and then the thrashing of metal. We continued to venture through the carts, chilled air entering our bodies, and tiredness catching up to us. We had gotten to the last cart, the conductor's. I was right. The door is more reinforced than the others. Surely it'll stop the beast. Knocking on the door, I try to speak, but my throat can't take it anymore. Anne noticed my failed attempt to speak. Hello, Mr. Conductor? Open up the door, please. Knock after knock. Yeah, hello? Are you all right, my dear? A voice. Another person. A bit banged up, but I'll be fine. A young sir patched me up. He's here with me. Please open the door. She shouted, the clanking of metal rushing toward us. Of course, let me unlock the door. We could hear keys jiggling around and the moving of gears. The train started again. We'll be able to get to the station. With that thought, the heavy metal door opened with force. Me and Anne falling into the conductor cart. Boy, quickly, I can't close the door myself. The man yelled. Faster than lightning and full of adrenaline, I had pushed the door into its hinge and then locked by the conductor. How far from the next station, sir? Anne asked. Finally, she seemed calmer than ever before. Not too far, young miss. I've already contacted the ones in charge, and they called the police and animal control. The man said with a smile. Anne shouted with excitement. I was just glad that we may escape with our lives. Just imagine if I didn't try to talk. Would I be the only one here with the conductor? Or maybe worse, I could have ended up like that poor blokes in the back. We arrived at the station. The conductor and I pulled the door open and with Anne made a mad dash to the platform where men with pistols awaited our arrival. Grabbing me and Anne, they took us down to the station corridor, not before a loud roar erupted from behind. Skull Bear was right behind us. Once again, I grabbed Anne, and with the officers shouting at us to run over, the bear on all fours is gaining. We neared the exit, where a squad of animal handlers was ready to get the beast. Duck, a man shouted. I dragged myself and Anne to the floor. The conductor hit the floor as well. Then we heard the shots and then a massive thud. We stood up quickly and saw that the massive beast that we had been running from till the sun was in the sky was now down and being taken away. I took a breath of air, seeing my breath in the cold, shining in the sun. I really need to practice talking more.